In this video, we will talk about how the Hemlock woolly adelgid, or HWA, and the elongate hemlock scale, or EHS, might possibly interact. To understand the effects of these two invasive species on hemlock trees, we have to consider how they may or may not interact with each other, these two invasive species. Will one end up dominating, or can they coexist? Do they have different or similar effects on the hemlocks? There's a lot of questions that you could be interested in. So the life cycles of these two invasive insects are described in another video. Understanding their life cycles helps us predict how they might interact, how their populations spread, and how they might affect the hemlocks. First, let's talk about how their life cycles are different. For the Hemlock woolly adelgid, there are females only in this part of the world. So in their invasive range in the eastern part of North America, they only go through asexual reproduction, and all of the adults are all female. Whereas the scale has separate sexes, two sexes, males and females, and they go through sexual reproduction only. The adelgid has 2 generations per year, every year. The scale has 1 generation per year. Sometimes it tries to sneak in a second generation and starts a second generation, but generally does not complete a second generation. They usually die off over the winter in the Northeast. The adelgids settle and feed on the xylem ray parenchyma cells at the base of the needles. So they're not directly on the needles themselves, they're at the base of the needles, and they stick their little pointy stylet into cells in the twig, not in the needle itself. So the xylem is the tissue that water transports through, and the parenchyma cells are around the xylem. So these are cells that tend to have a lot of sugar storage in them, and so they the adelgids stick their stylet in these cells and eat the sugar out of the xylem ray parenchyma cells. The scales, on the other hand, settle and feed on the mesophyll from the underside of the needle. So they live on the needles themselves, on the underside of the needle. Sometimes they settle so that they're actually under the cuticle of the hemlock needle. So you can sometimes see kind of the racing stripe of that white stripe going over them. But they are feeding on mesophyll cells, and mesophyll cells are ones that contain chlorophyll and are photosynthetic cells inside of leaves. So they are actually feeding from those cells inside of the leaf. So they're inside of the needle. So they're not feeding from the exact same cells, these two invasive insects. The Hemlock woolly adelgid goes through diapause in the summer, and diapause is a period of stasis where they're not feeding or growing or reproducing or really doing anything other than just staying alive. Kind of lowers their metabolism, and they're just it's like hibernation is the same idea, but in the winter. So diapause is when they're in this kind of stasis in the summer, whereas the adelgids are actually active and feeding and reproducing in the winter. The scales are opposite. They are active in the summer. Hemlock woolly adelgids make the hemlock increase resources to new growth. They preferentially like to settle on new growth, and then they basically force the hemlock to send more sugar to the xylem ray parenchyma cells in the branches that are infested. So they basically make the hemlock send more resources to that new growth where the hemlock's woolly adelgids will settle. The elongate hemlock scale, on the other hand, depletes infested needles of resources. So they tend to use up the resources on needles they are on, and they're not forcing the tree to send more nutrients there. There are some ways that these two species are the same, however. Both species have a first instar nymph that is a crawler stage that can actually crawl around, and for both of them that is their dispersal phase where they can actually go to a new location. They can crawl around on their own within a branch, probably not very far, They're very tiny. They can't travel very far on their own, but they can also be carried by wind or by animals, especially things like birds or small mammals like squirrels, etc. So they both do that, both species. Both species feeding nymphs are very sensitive to the quality of the hemlock foliage, although the adelgid probably more so. In general, their feeding nymphs can die off if the quality of the hemlock is too low. Both species are evolving more tolerance to cold, but do note that the scales in general are more tolerant to cold than the adelgids are. So in talking about how they kind of affect the health of the trees, I've made these little diagrams, which hopefully aren't too confusing, but basically in this diagram, the blue dots represent the hemlock woolly adelgid populations. The little green triangles are the hemlock health or growth, and across the x-axis is time in years. So in the first year, the hemlock woolly adelgid is attracted to very healthy trees. So you have healthy trees, and you might have a high population of hemlock woolly adelgids, but they cause the growth rate and health to decline rather rapidly. So in the second year, the health of the hemlocks and the growth of the hemlocks goes way down. Because the adelgid is so sensitive to that, their populations also tend to start decreasing. So they both go down. And then once the population of adelgids is low enough, then the tree can start recovering and the health and growth actually improves. And then the population of adelgids follows that. It also can increase again. And then the same pattern happens again. So over time, you kind of have both populations doing well, then crashing, then doing well, and then crashing. But over time, it's kind of a general downward trend that eventually the tree completely dies. In a warm climate, this can take as little as 4 years. In a colder climate, where the adelgids don't reproduce as well and survive as well and do as well, it can take a lot longer, more like 10 or 15 years. And recall that the adelgid can increase in numbers very rapidly because they reproduce asexually and they have 2 generations a year. So this is why the populations can quickly increase when the health of the tree is doing well. The elongate hemlock scale is a little bit different. They don't reproduce asexually. They reproduce sexually. They reproduce a little slower. They only have 1 generation per year, so their populations can't expand quite as quickly. Their populations grow more slowly. They also don't cause as dramatic a decline in the health of the tree. So you can see in the first year, here the scale population is represented by orange circles. So the population starts out pretty low. The health of the tree is high. Then every year, the health of the tree declines a little bit, and the population of the scale increases a little bit. And by the 4th year, the tree is not dead. So it takes a lot longer to kill the trees. In fact, there's not a lot of evidence that the scales do consistently cause hemlock death, but they do kind of slowly cause the hemlock to decline over time. Now, as I mentioned a little before, cold has an effect on these species. In particular, the adelgid is a little more sensitive to cold. There are many studies that have been done. Here's just an example of a few important results from some studies done in the past on cold tolerance or the effects of cold on the adelgids. So cold temperatures have been shown to limit the spread of the adelgids northward and do increase hemlock survival time. So the colder it is, the longer the hemlocks survive and the slower the adelgids spread. There is evidence, as I mentioned earlier, that the adelgid is evolving to be more tolerant of cold here in the Northeast. So it's getting a little bit better at handling the cold generation after generation. However, if it gets cold enough, it can really cause a large die-off. Last winter in 2014 to 2015, the adelgids had a huge die-off from the really cold winter in Massachusetts. The U.S. Forest Service, Forest Health Protection, Forest Pest Conditions Program reported that there was a very large die-off in that winter in Massachusetts because of the cold. If we just compare the adelgids versus the scales in general, what research has been done, here's two examples of some studies that were done comparing these two species. So one study by Pricer et al. In 2008 showed that from 1997 to 2005, the scale density kind of slowly increased in Massachusetts, whereas the adelgid population actually decreased in Massachusetts and Connecticut. A study by Miller, Pierce, and Pricer in 2012 showed that the scales settle just as well in a tree, whether there's adelgids already there or not. So it doesn't really seem to care about whether the adelgids are there or not. But the adelgid does not settle as well on a tree infested with scales. So if a tree is heavily infested with scales, the adelgids might have a harder time settling on that tree. This could be partly because the adelgids are so sensitive to hemlock tree health. So if the scales have already declined the health of the tree, then the adelgids aren't really attracted to it, and the feeding nymphs can't really survive very well on that tree. So many people ask me, well, how do these species even interact with each other? They don't actually, they're both on the hemlocks, but they're on different little parts. I mean, they're pretty close together. They're all on the branches, but the adelgids are at the base of the needle and the scales are on the needle. So they're not directly interacting with each other. What kind of competition might they have? Well, there's lots of different kinds of competition. One type of competition is interference competition, where there is direct interaction between the two competitors. They're fighting, physically interacting with each other over a particular resource, whether it's food or shelter or mates or space or whatever. Exploitative competition is where you have an indirect interaction. So these two different competitors are not directly physically interacting with each other, but they're both trying to exploit the same resource. So they are both using the same resource and they're negatively affecting each other by both using the same limited resource. But they're not directly interacting with each other. Apparent competition is where you see a negative effect of two species on each other, but they're not actually competing with each other per se. If they share a same predator, this is called apparent competition, where having one of the species there attracts more predators, and that also negatively affects the other species. So by having both of them together, they attract more predators, which means they actually have a negative effect on each other, but they're not actually competing over a resource. Unless you call that resource safety, then they're maybe competing over that, I suppose you could say. So there are different kinds of competition. What kind of competition is going on between these two species? As I mentioned, you only have the adelgids at the base of the needles and the scales on the needles. So they're not directly interacting with each other. And in fact, they're feeding off of different cells. The scales are feeding off of mesophyll cells in the needle, and the adelgids are feeding off of xylem ray parenchyma cells in the twig. So they're not feeding off the same exact cells, but they're both drawing resources from the same tree. So they are competing over the resources that the tree has in general. So this would be called exploitative competition, most likely. So what I'd like you to do is think about what to predict is going to happen with these two species. Will one species kind of win over the other, or will they just continue to coexist? Ecological and evolutionary knowledge predicts that if two different species are competing over the same limited resource, that they can't coexist in using that same resource over the long term, that one will either outcompete the other. One will either die off or go use a different resource, or, go elsewhere, die off, or evolve to use a different resource in some way. So if there's a limited resource, you might predict that one will actually outcompete the other, or you might see that if the resource is not limited enough, that they might continue to coexist, at least for a long time in the relative near future. So one argument on the adelgid side is that populations can grow faster because they do 2 generations per year. They don't have to have sex, so you can spread from a single individual. They settle and begin feeding just 1 month earlier in the spring than the scale, so they tend to spread faster, the population. An argument on the scale side that they could outcompete the adelgids is that they're more tolerant of cold. They're more tolerant of poor quality hemlocks. Sexual reproduction gives more genetic variation for selection to act on. So think about, given what you've seen and what you see in the data, what you think might actually happen. And you should talk about this especially if you're focusing in your lab report on infestation rates and comparing the 2 species in any way. You should really think about how these species might interact with each other, how they might affect the hemlock itself, whether it would be the same, whether they're both on the tree or just one is on the tree, and really think about that and see what you can pull out of interpreting the data. What did we find, and what do you think this means in the bigger context of, can these species coexist? Will one outcompete the other? How will things go into the future? How would climate change come into this? So there's a lot of interesting things that you can talk about and bring into your lab report.